Okay, so we're looking at Perek Chamishi. We're looking at the idea of chesed, and the chesed that we're looking at is the chesed of giving tzedakah la'aniyim. Tzedakah to aniyim, and even though the simple pshat is, I give tzedakah to aniyim, so HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives me charity and tzedakah. The Ramak once again introduces the Cabalistic framework here, and he says, Aniyim is a reference symbolically to the spheros of Yesod and Malchus. Now again, why is that so? Again, you have to remember the anatomical layout of the map here, in which the midah of Chesed is the right arm, the midah of Devorah is the left arm, Tiferes is the torso, Netzach is the right leg, Yesod is the left leg, Hod is the left leg, and Yesod is the male organ. Malchus is the feminine aspect of creation, and therefore the notion is you have to align Yesod with Malchus, and that is the Yichud, the unification of Kudsha Brichu, which are all 6 spheros, but coming through Yesod, and the Shekhinah. Right, as I said before, the prayer L'Shem Yichud says L'Shem Yichud Kudsha Brichu U'Shechinte, the unification of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Shekhinah. Again, as I say over and over and over again, these are metaphorical descriptions of how divine blessing enters the world, and it does it through the imagery of a sexual unification of the 6 spheros, which are called Kudsha Brichu, or they're called Zeir Anpin, the small face of God, and unification with Malchus, which is called Shekhinah, which is called Nukva, which is called the feminine. So as a result, the imagery of Aniyim are Yesod, because Yesod needs to be filled with the Hashpa'ot that come from the other spheros, because Yesod is the conduit, like the male organ conducts the sperm. And Malchus is also awaiting some unification. So therefore, symbolically, the aniyim that you want to take care of is you want to both be mesakein, to rectify, and to unify Yesod and Malchus. They are called allegorically the aniyim, and therefore the way you take care of it is by giving them tzedakah. And you'll remember that tzedakah that you give them, i.e. the spheros of Yesod and Malchus, is the acronym of tzedakah, is 90 amens, 4 kedushos, 100 brachos, right, tzadik, tzad, dalet, kofei, and hey, chumshei Torah, and that itself was a little unclear exactly what does it mean, hey, chumshei Torah, so I had given you 2 explanations. One is that it's a general reference to doing mitzvos, which are in the 5 books of the Torah. The other is that one should recite passages from the 5 books of the Torah every day, and those passages would include, some read the 6 days of creation from Bereshis, and then in Shemos we have the 2 parshios of the first 2 parshios of Tefillin, Kadesh, V'haya Ki V'yacha, which is in Bo, and then Vayikra, you have some of the Korbanos, Parshios are Vayikra. Bamidbar, number 1 is the Parsha Satamid, is actually in Bamidbar, and that would count for Bamidbar. And then Devorim would be Shema, Vayam Shemoah, and the Parsha of Tzitzis is also in Bamidbar, right? So it's not so much that it got to be the 5 Chumashim, but the specific readings that are found in the 5 Chumashim. So this is the tzedakah that you are giving to Yesod and Malchus to fix them up and bring them together. And that is the notion of helping the aniyim. They're called aniyim. Why are they called aniyim? Because they are bereft of any inner content, meaning to say, Chesed, Devorah, Tiferes has actual spiritual light. Once you get to Yesod, Yesod is receiving the light from those other spheros and then passes it on to Malchus, which also doesn't have anything of its own. And therefore, in the poetic, metaphoric, allegorical language of Kabbalah, Yesod and Malchus are called the impoverished spheros. They are the poverty spheros that need to receive divine shefa, and therefore you must give tzedakah to them through the 90 amains and the 4 kedushos and the 100 brachos and the 5 chumshei Torah. Now, again, we could spend, you could spend your life on these paragraphs, literally. You can do this the whole day. But I just want to point out that in a way, the imagery is a very indirect imagery, because Lamaisa, if the idea is that when I do this chesed, I'm masakin the sviros, well, that's not really what's happening. When I give charity to the poor, there's no direct linkage in Yesod and Malchus. In other words, that's a different tzedakah. The tzedakah you give to Yesod and Malchus is not the tzedakah that you're giving to the poor. So it's hard to really see how the tzedakah that I am doing is a direct tikkun in Yesod and Malchus, because the tzedakah that is masakein Yesod and Malchus is a different tzedakah. You know what I'm saying? So the association here is b'chlal not clear. The Ramak will do that in a few of the others as well, in which the chesed is done in a different way in order to have the tikkun, and it's not the actual chesed that you're doing. Okay. Now, then he goes further, and he, as I mentioned yesterday, he breaks down the specific things you give to the poor, and each one has its own rectification that it is accomplishing. Tzedakah is to fix and unify, both fix, be masakein, and be ma'achet, tikkunim and yichudim, of aniyim, and the aniyim are called Yesod and Malchus. But then he breaks it down, because tzedakah has many, many forms. We have, in addition to generic tzedakah, we have Leket, Shichicha, and Peah. Now, let me just point out, just halachically, Leket, Shichicha, and Peah are very different than tzedakah and Maser Ani. And be sure you understand conceptually the difference. When it comes to tzedakah, generally, and that includes meiser of my income, and the Meiser Ani, which is a meiser of your crops that you only give 2 out of the 7 years of Shemitah, year 3 and year 6. The common denominator of tzedakah, Meiser Kesafim, meiser of income, and Meiser Ani, from grain or fruits or vegetables that are grown in Eretz Yisrael, is you have what is called Tovas Hana'ah. Tovas Hana'ah means you decide where you want to give it. I decide where my tzedakah goes. I decide where my Meiser Kesafim goes. I decide where my Meiser Ani goes. If a poor person shows up and wants to take my Meiser Ani, I have the right to say, it's not for you. Now, yeah, there is a halacha. If an ani asks you for something, you're supposed to give him something. Okay, that's true. So you give him a shekel. In other words, I don't have to give him. Now, if an ani just says, I'd like your Meiser Ani, or I'd like you to give me 10% of your income, you don't have to do that. You have the right to decide which aniyim will get your tzedakah, your meiser, and your Meiser Ani, your grain. And again, the technical term for that is Tovas Hana. You get the benefit, the Hana of deciding who gets the Tova. In fact, it's an interesting question in the Gemara. The Gemara has a machlokas in many, many places. Is Tovas Hana considered to be an ownership? An example would be for Kedushin. Right? In order to marry a woman, you have to give her something that's worth at least a pruta. Right? You don't have to give her a ring. You can give her a penny. You can give her a stick of gum. Well, a stick of gum might not be, but you can certainly give her a package of gum, and that would be a valid marriage. Right? Again, in the modern Orthodox world of co-ed schools, Seventh graders love this. They learn the Mishnah and Kedushin that you marry a girl with a shava pruta. So at recess they'll go around, and giving a girl, hey, be my wife. They love it. And every year there are different shilas in these schools. Is the woman an Ish? Does she have to cover her hair? All sorts of different questions about this. Okay, so Baruch Hashem, at least when we're separated, we don't have those quasi-kedushin situations. So the question is the following. If I have Meiser Ani, and the Meiser Ani is not mine, I'm not allowed to eat it, I'm not allowed to use it. My only zechutz in the Meiser Ani is I get to decide which poor person gets it. Do we consider that enough of an ownership that I could give my Meiser Ani to a woman and says, Harei at Mekudeshesli, I am betrothing you with my rights to decide which Ani gets the Meiser Ani, so you have that right. I'm giving you that right. So that's a machlokus in the Gemara. If Tovas Hana'a is treated as mammon, it is treated like a monetary ownership of something, and therefore you could be makadesh a woman by giving her your tovas hana, or do I say tovas hana is not really a property right, and therefore you can't, right? So there are practical nafkaminas. Can I be makadesh an isha with tovas hana, or tzedakah money, or the like? In other words, she's not poor. If she's poor, for sure I could be makadesh her with, I'm giving her something she can actually eat. But if the only thing I'm giving her is something that she could decide who to give it to, that's a machlokus, is that called property. Okay. Now that is true for tzedakah, and that is true for meiser of income, and that is true for meiser ani, from crops. But leket, shichicha, and peah are not things you give to the poor, they are things you leave to the poor. So anyone that qualifies as an ani, you are not allowed to stop them. You cannot even impose limits. I mean, let's assume you got some big burly guy who happens to be an ani, and he's taken everything, and you would like to save some for your next door neighbor who's a little slow or whatever it would be. There's an iser d'oraisa for you to prevent an ani from collecting leket, shichicha, and peah, even if you're holding it back for another ani. So it is very important to understand that leket, shichicha, and peah is very different than the other tzedakos, because there is no concept of tovas hana. That's why the lashon of the Torah is not that you give it to the poor, but the lashon of the Torah is la'ani v'lager tazov osam. You abandon it for the poor, right? Not nesina, but tazov, aziva, leave it alone. Okay. Again, just to remind you, bisman hazeh, most poskim say we are not mechuyev to leave leket, shichicha, and peah for aniyim, because the aniyim are miyayish. They don't really expect to get their sustenance that way, because they'll get government programs. It's much easier, so to speak, to get something from the government, or even to collect money, than to go during a harvest and look for parts of the field that were left and the like. So therefore the poskim say that we already know from a number of mishnayos that when the aniyim b'derech klal are miyayish, they give up hope, they don't expect to be supported that way, so you're allowed to take it for yourself. And therefore, lamaisa, we do not leave leket, shichicha, peah today, although the Vilna Gaon actually says that there's an inyan for a Baal Nefesh to be machmir. So some people are machmir, but b'derech klal, that is not the minhag. So if you were planning on participating in harvesting crops because of the chayalim that are not available in agricultural work, you should not be dissuaded because you're worried, as one person told me, was worried about leket, shichicha, and peah obligations. Again, what is the difference? Leket is what falls from the sickle or falls from the knife. Now again, today, at least grain is generally not harvested by hand. Usually there are harvesters, but fruits and the like are still harvested by cutting, manual cutting, and things that fall beyond the knife or the sickle, they have to be left for the poor. That's called leket. Shichicha are bound sheaves of grain that the workers or the owner or the workers forgot to collect. They were positioned in a certain place, and then you forgot to collect them. You don't go back. You have to leave it for the poor. And Peah is intentional. You must leave the corners of your field for the aniyim. The oraisa, Peah has no shiur. You can leave one stalk at each of the corners. Midrabanan, it should add up to 1/60th of the field. There is a whole Maseches, of course. The second Maseches of the Mishnah is Maseches Peah, which also has Leket and Shichicha in it as well. There is no, as I'm sure you know, there is no Talmud Bavli on Maseches Peah, just as there generally is no Talmud Bavli on Seder Zeraim other than Brachos. There is a Talmud Yerushalmi on Maseches Peah. So that's Leket, Shich, and Be'ah. So now, here's what the Ramak says. Now here, I'm going to have to plead my ignorance. I am just going to tell you the words, and I do not have a very good understanding of it. He says the following. Once again, the aniyim, allegorically, are Yesod and Malchus. Yesod and Malchus are the aniyim. Why are they called aniyim? Because they have no inner content of their own spiritual energy. Rather, Yesod is makabel from the other spheros, and as the male organ, it transmits it downwards. And Malchus also has nothing, it just receives from Yesod. So as a result, they are called aniyim. And what you really want to do is, by the tzedakah you give these aniyim, which once again is the 90 amens, and the 4 kedushais, and the 100 brachais, and the heicham shetorah, I give tzedakah to them. They receive tzedakah from above, and in particular from Tiferes, because Tiferes is the optimal combination of Chesed and Geburah, and therefore the imagery here is that Al Yedei, the tzedakah that I give, as defined, I will enable Yesod and Malchus, or Yesod in particular, to be Moshech tzedakah from Tiferes. It will bring down the light from Tiferes, which will then pass down to Malchus. Okay, you see that's the imagery. Now, he then goes further, and he says, the tzedakah, and again, I'm warning, I'm just going to give you words here. He says, the tzedakah is nimshach from Tiferes, but there will be leket from all of the spheros. There will be shichicha from the highest sheaf of grain, which is Bina. I'll explain a little bit of this. And Peah from Malchus itself. Now again, before we try to see some meaning in these words, let me just point out what the Ramak is doing. The Ramak is, and really only a great Makobel could understand this. The Ramak is saying that each form of tzedakah has a unique and distinct tikkun in the world of the spheros. Again, the bottom line is not so difficult to understand. We're talking about rectifying, unifying spheros to create divine energy. But the Ramak is being very, 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 very specific as to the source of each of these things. Tzedakah is Moshech, the ohr from Tiferes to Yesod. That's the big one. Now, Leket is like leftover sheaves that dropped from the knife, represents a residual light in every one of the spheros. And therefore, to be malaket, even the word malaket is to gather from many, many sources. So if tzedakah is Moshech specifically from Tiferes, Leket takes the light of all of the spheros and passes them down. Now, what about Shichicha, the forgotten sheaf? That goes all the way up and it's moshech from Bina. Now here, I can give you a tiny bit of an explanation. You'll remember that Bina, we have Chochmah and Bina. And Chochmah is a masculine element, Bina is a feminine element, and the like. Now, you'll remember Bina was said to be the source of tshuva. Bina is connected to the world of tshuva. Now, why would Bina be connected to tshuva? I mean, Bina is understanding. So the concept is this. Bina, now Chachma is a male element which brings into being something, but in the woman's womb, the little bit of thing that the husband deposited gets formed, it gets boundaries, it gets contoured, it gets contained. It gets contained. So as a result, it is said that Bina is actually the source of Devorah. See, we make a mistake when we talk about Chesed as loving kindness and Devorah as strict judgment. We make a mistake when we think Chesed is good and Devorah is bad. In reality, Devorah is what gives structure and limits to the Chesed of God. Because if the Chesed of Hashem would not have boundaries, it would just keep going. Think about, this was countless situation comedies of my youth. Remember Lucille Ball and the like. I don't know if you've heard of Lucille Ball. But anyway, these like ice cream machines, these soft ice creams that you can't shut off. So it keeps on going and going and going and going. It fills up the room. It goes into the street. You got to have some way of shutting off the machine. Otherwise, it keeps on going. So Devorah has a positive role in Bria. That's why Tiferes requires Chesed and Devorah. Because it limits the light of God so I could receive it. Otherwise, I would just be self-annihilated. I would just disappear. Like the candle disappears in the sun. You bring a candle to the sun, the candle doesn't exist anymore. So Devorah in its inception is sweet. The Devoros, as they come out of Bina, are sweet. They are really ways of defining the Chesed. But as they get into lower levels, they can become harsh punishments and the like. So what tshuva does is, tshuva, I return to my prior state, means the Devoros return. They're recycled to their prior state within Bina. And then the Devoros become sweetened. Now again, this is a complicated way of saying a simple idea. The simple idea is, when you do tshuva, God shows you mercy. But the Kabbalist would say the following, that it's a midah keneged midah. By my returning to my prior state, I return the harshness to its makor in Bina. And in Bina, the Devoros are mimutokos. They are sweetened. That is the connection between Bina and tshuva. Another connection is that Bina is the last midah before the last seven spheros, including from Chesed through Malchus. And therefore it's Echad Rochev al Sheva. It is one that is riding on top of seven. Right? Bina is one that is on top of seven, and that corresponds to the Yovel year, which is 1 year on top of 7 Shemitah cycles. And therefore, Bina is also called Yovel. And what happens in Yovel? Everything goes back to their original source. The slaves go back to their freedom. The property, the real estate, goes back to the original owners. Okay, so therefore it's called the world of Yovel. So it's the world of Tshuva, it's the world of Yovel, It is the recycling of Devorah. So here the Ramak adds another appellation. Bina is called the world of forgetfulness. Bina is called Shichicha. Why is Bina called Shichicha? Because once again, the nature of forgiveness is kaviyachol. God forgets your sins. This is an important idea because you know what the old saying? The old saying is, you can forgive but not forget. Man, I can't forget. The koyach of tshuva, I mean, of course, in a sense, God never forgets, but in terms of relationship, the idea is that God doesn't only forgive, but God forgets. Again, not really forgetting, but God's relationship to you is ki'ilu, he forgot. So therefore, since Bina is connected to tshuva, Bina is also called Shichicha. So in this highly symbolic language, therefore, he says, when you give tzedakah, you're meishech from Tiferes to Yesod and Malchus. When you have Leket, Leket is scattered grains that you bring together, you're ma'asef, kochot, from all of the spheres. When you give Shichicha, what you're doing specifically is you're moshech from Bina, which is the world of forgetfulness, because that's the world of tshuva. Now, then he says, and when you give Peah, this is interesting, Peah is the corners, you're actually getting something, this is again hard to understand, from within Malchus itself. That apparently, although Malchus is largely an empty receptacle, in fact, that's why Malchus is called Oni. And yet, there is a residual spiritual energy within Malchus itself that can come out. And that's called Peah because it's at the corners of Malchus. Now again, if the Ramak means that these are specific tikkunim that are caused by the mitzvos of Leket, Shichicha, and Peah, then the fact that we don't do that today seems to be a genuine loss. It's not just we're not doing a mitzvah, but Cabalistically, and again, I don't know what the Ramak's halachic position would be, but I would actually be very surprised if the Ramak held you a putter from this, because given the fact that the Ramak specifically tells you what these particular mitzvahs accomplish, would indicate that there might be a special reason Cabalistically to be osek in these mitzvahs. Yeah.
Do you have to say that if these corrections still need to happen, that Hashem will make it so that in the future there will be aniyim and these mitzvahs will be performed to get the necessary repairs?
Well, yes, I think that's very true. On the other hand, the halachic issue today is not that we don't have aniyim. The halachic issue is that the aniyim don't expect to get their parnasa from it. By the way, one could actually raise the question, which is even a question that maybe perhaps people aren't even aniyim today within the definition of Leket, Shichicha, and Peah, because, the standard of being an ani for Leket, Shichicha, and Peah is a very, very, very low standard. Or put it another way, the bar is very high, meaning you got to be really, 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 really poor. And even people who are poor are not meeting the definition of what is poor for Leket, Shichicha, and Peah. So that might be another problem, yeah.
Is it possible that the Malchus we're referring to is not the Malchus of whichever circle right now, but the Malchus from above coming into this world?
That might be that. Again, it might be possible because, as you said, we have these four worlds, and Malchus of the world of Yitzira, which is above us, becomes Keser of the world of Hasiya. So you are being Moshech something. It is possible, although he doesn't say that, so it's hard to read it into his words. Okay. So again, as I say, I would be tempted to just skip over this, but I bedafka want to introduce you to it just so you see the power of the language. There is something just in the terminology itself that has a certain koach and a certain hashpah that can elevate a person. That's why the Chazon Ish wrote. The Chazon Ish, well, Chazon Ish obviously knew Kabbalah, but the Chazon Ish was not necessarily, he didn't write about Kabbalah that much, and he didn't talk about Kabbalah that much. But the Chazon Ish said that just reading the Zohar, just with the most simplest translation, is a great power in Yiras Shamayim. It just gives a person a sense of reverence, a sense of Kedusha. So I think when you just hear these languages, even though we really don't really understand them, there is a certain power that it gives us about the significance of the mitzvos that we do. Now, he then goes a little further. It's really Chiddush after Chiddush, just amazing thing. After he says specifically that each form of tzedakah has a unique tikkun in the world of the spheres. So regular tzedakah is Moshech, the light of Tiferes, down to Yesod, which passes it on to Malchus. And then he says Leket takes the light of all the spheres, Leket, that which is gathered together. And Shichicha is Moshech from Bina, which is the world of Tshuva, which is Hashem forgetting about your sins. And Peah is a light from within Malchus itself. He then points out, now this pasuk is not by tzedakah generally. This pasuk is specifically by Leket, Shichicha, and Peah. Le'ani v'lager tazov osam. Right, I mentioned this pasuk before. You shall abandon it. You shall leave it for the poor and for the ger. I'll come to ger in a moment. Now, this is a very important point halachically, as I indicated before. Unlike Meiser Ani and Tzedakah and Meiser of your income, where you can decide which poor person gets it, Leket, Shichicha, and Peah have to be left for any poor person who claims it. If you hold back Leket, Shichicha, and Peah because you want to give it to another Ani, you are transgressing the mitzvah saseh of La'ani v'lager tazeh v'esam. Okay, that's very important, even though we don't do this mitzvahs today, but when these mitzvahs apply, this is very important. You cannot withhold Leket, Shichicha, and Peah for another Ani. Of course, the Gemara gives you eitzes. Jews always come up with tricks. The Gemara actually says, if you really don't want the guy to do it, you can be mafker all of your property, declare yourself an ani, and then take it for yourself. But the problem is, you're mafker all your property, so he could take all your property. He said, okay, you get the leket, I'll take your house. So we can, that sounds like a good trade-off, and the like. Okay. Now, just looking at the pasuk is a little shver. You must leave it for the ani and for the ger. Well, mimanavshach. If the ger is poor, then he's an ani like anybody else. If the ger is rich, he taka cannot take leket, shichicha, and peah. So you don't leave leket, shichicha, and peah for the ani or for the ger. You leave it for the ani. The ani could be a born Jew or the ani could be a ger. In other words, the fi pshuto shel mikra, there actually is no particular reason why the Torah would say la'ani v'lager tazav osam. Yeah, the Baalei Pshat say because in the time of the Torah and later during the Bayis Rishon, most Gerim were poor because they really could not have full ownership of land in Eretz Yisrael and the like, because the land was not given to them. So a Stam Ger was an Ani. But the emes is, if a Stam Ger is an Ani, then why say it at all? Just say Ani. And so that's a good kasha. That is a kasha in the simple meaning of the pasuk. But here the Ramak, and this is not at all the pshat in the pasuk, but the Ramak gives a Cabalistic understanding that we already said Ani is a reference to the two spheros of Yesod and Malchus. Yesod, which is the male organ, is empty and it has to receive all of the light either from Tiferes or the other spheros. And Malchus is empty like a womb, and it needs to be filled up from Yesod. And therefore, Yesod and Tiferes, the male organ and the female womb, are described as aniyim that have to be makabel. But now he says the following. There is what you might call a bypass. In other words, the normal way it works is that Yesod is makabel from Tiferes or from the other Spheros and passes it down. Which means Tiferes does not directly go to Malchus. Tiferes conveys to Yesod and Yesod conveys to Malchus. But he says, there is a certain madrega, a certain spiritual intensity in which Tiferes itself descends into Malchus. Now that's a very strong light because that is not a light that is mediated through the transmission of Yesod. It's a direct shefa from Tiferes. Now this cannot be explained by a biological metaphor, meaning Yesod to Malchus can be explained by sexual intimacy. This is like a direct, the closest thing would be chas v'shalom, the Christian idea of a virgin birth, or whatever it would be. But this is kind of like a virgin birth in the sense that the light of Tiferes goes directly to Malchus and creates a shefa without going through Yesod. Again, I'm saying words. I don't pretend to understand what I'm talking about, but I want to share it with you. Now, the Ramak says, since Tiferes is not the normal habitat, since Malchus is not the normal habitat of Tiferes, Tiferes is called the wandering stranger that comes into Malchus. It's called a ger. And therefore, la'ani v'la'ger tazo v'osam indicates that these mitzvos not only help the ani, that is called Yesod, but it also helps the wandering stranger that is called Tiferes, which means we don't know when it'll be this way or that way, but there is even an aspect of Tiferes going down into Malchus directly without the conduit of Yesod, and that is called ger. Again, this is a stunning interpretation. Cabalistically, this is obviously not pshat in the pasuk. La'oni v'la'ger taza v'isam. You're helping the ani, and you're helping the ger. Tiferes that lives in Malchus is called a ger. Not in the sense of a convert, but in the sense of a stranger, because it's hanging around a neighborhood that it normally does not go to, but that's an unusually strong divine energy that comes into the world. Okay?
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.